34-year-old Diane Newton King woke up before sunrise. She showered, she curled her bangs, she did her makeup, and then she dressed for work in the most professional women's fashion of the day. She put on pantyhose, a pencil skirt, and a blazer with the absolutely massive shoulder pads. It was the spring of 1990, and in Battle Creek, Michigan, Diane was one of the biggest names in town. Diane anchored the morning news show for Battle Creek's local TV station, WUHQ, which meant most days of the week, Diane had to leave her house by no later than 4:30 a.m. As she shuffled around her two-story farmhouse in her pantyhose, trying to figure out where her briefcase was, Diane's husband, Brad, hollered up at her from the kitchen to tell her that breakfast would be ready in 5 minutes. Diane was thrilled. She had recently discovered that she was pregnant with their second child, and so she was constantly feeling hungry. Diane finally found her briefcase, then she slipped on her shoes and made her way downstairs into the kitchen. Her firstborn child, 2-year-old Marler, was sitting in his high chair chomping away on some apple slices. Diane kissed him on the forehead before sliding into her own seat at the kitchen table. 43-year-old Brad brought Diane a plate of scrambled eggs and toast. It was her favorite, and he made it for her every morning. Brad worked part-time as a criminal justice professor at the University of Western Michigan, but he liked to tell people that his real job was taking care of Diane and Marler. And for the most part, that was actually pretty true. Most days, while Diane was at work, Brad managed things on the home front. It was an untraditional dynamic for the time, and some of their friends jokingly called him Mr. Diane King, but Brad didn't mind. He was proud of Diane, and he was happy to support her this way. Diane scarfed down her breakfast, gave Brad and Marler a kiss goodbye, and then she grabbed her coat and raced out the door just as the clock hit 4:30 a.m. Outside the farmhouse, Diane paused for just a moment. She'd always wanted to live on a farm, and when she looked out across their property, with the cement silo on the left and the old red and white Victorian barn on the right, and the hundreds of acres of farmland and woods surrounding the house, she felt like she was really living her dream, even though the family didn't do any actual farming. But someday, Diane thought, maybe after the baby came, she'd leave the TV station to focus on her family and maybe even grow a few vegetables. But for now, all that would have to wait. It would be months and months before the baby arrived, and Diane had a lot of things she wanted to accomplish before then. So Diane, standing on her front stoop, took one more deep breath of clean country air, then she walked down the gravel driveway and hopped into her brand new Jeep Wagoneer. Diane then slowly drove down her long driveway, and when she reached the black mailbox at the end of the driveway, she turned right onto Divison Drive, the street she'd called home for more than a year now. And from there, she snaked her way through the neighborhood out to the highway. About 20 minutes later, Diane was sitting behind her desk, diving into yet another busy day of reading the news. Most days, when Diane arrived at the office, the first thing she would do is review her scripts for the day. Then she would anchor the morning news show, and then Diane and her staff would spend the rest of the day reporting and writing stories for future news segments. Diane worked a lot, and she worked really hard. She was actually a perfectionist, and she expected perfection from the people around her. And sometimes that perfectionism rubbed her colleagues the wrong way. But the people who actually watched her on TV, the audience, loved her. Diane was constantly being invited to meet local celebrities and attend different charity events around town. But despite how well things seemed to be going both professionally and personally for Diane, something very unusual would start to happen to her, and it would change her life forever. It all started with a phone call. Diane was at the office, sitting behind her desk, working on a story, when her phone rang. Now, remember, this was 1990, so Diane did not have a cell phone or even caller ID. All she had was a landline. So Diane's phone began to ring, and without hesitation, Diane picked it up because the people who typically called her on this line were her colleagues or sources or people who knew her personally. But this day, the caller was not any of those things. Instead, the caller was a fan. Diane didn't ask the caller what their name was, but based on their voice, Diane guessed that the caller was a male, probably in his 20s or 30s. He said he had been watching Diane on TV, and he was so inspired by her reporting, he was thinking about getting into broadcasting himself, and he wanted to know if Diane had any advice about how to break into the business. Diane was caught off guard that this guy got her number, but she was polite and professional, and ultimately recommended that he get enrolled in the communications department at the local community college. Diane even recommended specific classes she thought he should take. The fan thanked Diane for her time, and she wished him luck in his professional efforts, and then she hung up the phone, expecting never to hear from this guy again. But Diane would hear from him again. The fan started calling Diane's direct line on her desk on a very regular basis, sometimes as often as 3 times in a single week. And again, because Diane didn't have caller ID, she just kept answering his calls unintentionally. Despite being really annoyed by all these calls, Diane still remained very professional with the fan and continued to give him advice about how to do her job. However, the more he called, the more Diane sensed there was just something off about the guy. For one thing, she started to suspect that he wasn't actually interested in pursuing journalism. The questions he asked her didn't feel like the kind of questions you would expect from someone who was looking for guidance or information or even mentorship. They felt like an excuse to contact her, like he was making up questions just so that he could listen to her answer them. And there was something else that seemed kind of creepy. The more Diane heard from this guy, the more she noticed he had this very strange way of talking. It was slow and kind of slurred, almost like he was under the influence of some drug. Now, nothing this guy said to her was ever overtly rude or threatening, but after several calls, Diane couldn't help feeling like this guy could be a danger to her. And she had good reason to feel that way. For the last 2 years, every supermarket tabloid in the country had been running these stories about the rise in celebrity stalking cases. And now, the problem had gotten so serious that even the legitimate newspapers were covering these stories too. There were stories about celebrities getting threatening letters, and stories about their homes getting broken into, and some of these stories ended violently. Just 1 year earlier, an obsessed fan in Los Angeles, California, had shot and killed a young television actress on the doorstep of her own apartment. And it wasn't just the media that saw these stalking cases as being a big problem. Slowly, the government was also starting to realize that something had to be done. The problem was, nobody really knew what to do about it. In the 1990s, there were no anti-stalking laws anywhere in the country. And neither psychologists nor law enforcement could say for sure if it was better to confront a stalker head-on or simply ignore them. Diane wasn't sure if her situation with her fan would be considered a celebrity stalking case, but she was definitely feeling a bit scared of this guy and just wished he would leave her alone. So Diane consulted with the people closest to her, and everybody offered her different advice. One of her friends told her to be nice to the guy because who knows what would happen if she made him mad. One of her colleagues suggested that Diane just tell the guy to back off, but Diane could see that there was potential for problems in both of those situations. So Diane turned to Brad, her husband, not only because he was smart and an objective thinker, but also because, in addition to being a part-time professor of criminal justice, Brad also used to be a police officer. Brad, who was very concerned about his wife's stalking situation, told her that the safest thing she could do was simply cut off the guy's access to her. And the easiest way to do that was to set up some kind of arrangement with the receptionist at her work who could then screen Diane's calls. If the guy couldn't get through to Diane, eventually, Brad figured, he would just give up and stop calling. The plan made sense to Brad and to Diane, so she decided to give it a shot. Diane talked to the receptionist at the TV station, and they worked out a screening system. The way it worked was every call that came in on Diane's direct line would actually first ring at the front desk with the receptionist, and the receptionist would answer the phone, and if it was Brad or a colleague or a source calling for Diane, they would get pushed through. But when the receptionist got a call from the fan with the slow, slurred voice, she would tell him that Diane was not available. And the screening system worked great for several weeks. The fan would call and would be immediately turned away before Diane ever had to speak to him. But eventually, the screening system failed. One afternoon, around the end of the summer in 1990, Diane was in the newsroom sitting at her desk filing some papers when her direct landline on her desk started to ring. Diane picked it up before the end of the very first ring. She said, "Hello, this is Diane Newton King." And when she heard the voice on the other end of the line, she was so startled she almost dropped the receiver. It was the fan. He said, "Hello, Diane." Immediately, shivers ran up Diane's spine. Before Diane could hang up, the guy told Diane that he liked the way she looked and that he wanted to meet her in person. Specifically, he said, "I want to go to lunch with you." Diane wanted to scream, but she was so flustered and so scared that she sort of just started stammering until finally she was able to compose herself enough to tell the guy that she appreciated the offer, but she absolutely could not meet him in person. Then she slammed the phone down and started sobbing at her desk. As she cried, everybody in the newsroom looked over and was very concerned. That night, when Diane came home, she told Brad about what happened that day, and Brad was livid. How could this guy get through to her phone? Why didn't the receptionist screen the call? Brad called the station and demanded answers, but no one at the station, including the receptionist, had any idea how this guy got through to Diane. The station told Brad they would look into the situation right away and make sure that from now on, absolutely no calls whatsoever would reach Diane's line unless they had first been screened. Now, it's unclear exactly what the station actually did to ensure that, but from that day forward, the fans' calls were always intercepted by someone at the station, and so Diane was protected from speaking with him. And after a couple of weeks, the fans' calls to the station started to slow down. And after a couple of months, the calls stopped entirely. And soon, Diane just kind of forgot about the fan and moved on to more important things in her life, like the upcoming arrival of her second child, a baby girl. And with this child, Diane was becoming more and more conflicted about what she wanted in life. Suddenly, her career just felt a whole lot less important than being home with her kids. And so she started talking more openly with her family and friends about potentially leaving the station after her daughter was born so she could be a stay-at-home mom and enjoy a simple farmhouse life with her family. But all of that excitement and optimism about the future would come to an abrupt end one night in the fall of 1990. On the night before Halloween that year, so about 5 months after the first fan phone call, Brad told Diane that he was going to be working late that night at the university and so wouldn't be home until later in the evening, which meant Diane would have to be on primary parent duty for Marler that afternoon when she got home from work. Now, under normal circumstances, this would not be a big deal. Diane had done plenty of parenting on her own, and she loved spending time with Marler. What made this night so different was that Diane was now 8 months pregnant. Her belly was massive, her hormones were raging, and her joints hurt so much she could barely walk. On top of all of that, Diane was in the middle of a big project at work that was totally stressing her out. Nevertheless, when she finished her shift at the station that day, Diane drove to Marler's daycare, she picked him up, and then they headed home. By the time Diane turned onto her street, Divison Drive, Marler was already passed out in the back of the car in his car seat, and Diane's body was really starting to ache. So when Diane turned into her driveway, instead of stopping the car and getting out to get the mail in the mailbox by the road, she simply pulled the car right up alongside the mailbox and reached out and collected the mail through her window. And after she had the stack of letters sitting on her lap, she began flipping through them. And right away, one letter caught her attention. It was in a typical white envelope, just like most of the other letters in her lap, but this one had no postage and nothing written on it, and it wasn't sealed. Diane opened the envelope, retrieved the letter inside, and then opened it up to read, and what she saw instantly terrified her. There was just one sentence on the page, but it wasn't written by hand. Each letter of this sentence had been cut out of a magazine and then scotch taped to the page, like one of those ransom letters you see in the movies. The sentence on this strange letter read, "You should have gone to lunch with me." Diane knew immediately that this letter was from the fan. Clearly, he'd found out where she lived, and he'd visited her house that day to drop it off. In fact, she realized with sudden alarm that this guy might actually still be in the area, waiting for her to come home. In that moment, Diane forgot about everything else she had going on. She forgot about how much her body hurt and how tired she felt. She even forgot about the sleeping baby sitting right behind her. Diane just started screaming like a banshee. Then she threw the car into reverse, backed away from the mailbox, slammed on the gas, and drove away from her house as fast as she possibly could. About 15 minutes later, Diane showed up at her friend Cindy Acosta's house. Diane and Cindy worked together at the TV station, and Cindy was one of the first people Diane had reached out to for advice when this fan started calling her. When Cindy opened the door, Diane, who was carrying Marlar, practically collapsed into Cindy's arms. In between sobs, Diane told Cindy about this letter and how scared she was, and right away, Cindy said, "We have to call the police." The police showed up a few minutes later and escorted Diane back to the farmhouse to search the property for intruders, but they didn't find anyone. Still, Diane was too afraid to stay at the house alone, so the police brought her back to Cindy's house, where she waited with Marlar until Brad was finally out of his class and could come and pick them up. After word got out about this threatening letter, the Battle Creek community really came together to support Diane. Also, the TV station beefed up their security around the office, Diane's sister bought them a dog, and Brad installed motion-censored lighting outside of their house. But none of those things actually made Diane feel any safer. She just couldn't shake the idea that her fan was watching her everywhere she went. Her fear got so paralyzing that Diane literally just stopped going outside the house at all except to go to work. And when she did have to go outside, she used a system that she and Brad created to ensure she was never outside alone. Diane would call Brad to tell him exactly when she would be home from work. That way, when she arrived, Brad would be outside waiting for her. If it was too cold for Brad to just stand outside, he would leave a particular light on in the house that was visible from the outside. This light was a signal to Diane that he was in the house and that everything was safe, so she could hustle out of her car and come inside no problem. On days that Brad was not home, when Diane returned home, she would call a neighbor to come meet her outside of her farmhouse. And if for some reason the neighbor arrived late, Diane would literally just sit in her driveway inside her car, waiting for the neighbor to show up. But all of this fear and all of this hiding had started to make Diane's world feel very small, and she really didn't like that. So after Diane gave birth to her second child, a blonde baby girl named Kateri, in November of 1990, Diane started trying to reconnect with her extended family. She started calling her sisters and mother much more often, and together, over the phone, the women would bond over the challenges and joys of raising their kids. And it was during this time, on these phone calls, that Diane started to talk more openly about her desire to leave the TV station altogether. She'd been thinking about it ever since she found out she was pregnant with Kateri, and now that Kateri was here, the whole thing felt much more real. Diane's extended family was very supportive and encouraging, and they pushed her to start leaving the house more often besides just going to work. They got her to start coming out to Detroit, where her extended family all lived, about 2 hours away from Battle Creek by car, so that she and her kids and the rest of the family could all participate more actively in each other's lives. And so, starting in late 1990/early 1991, every few weeks, after delivering the Thursday morning news break, Diane and her 2 kids would leave Battle Creek and head out to Detroit. They'd spend a few days with Diane's mother and sisters, and then on that following Saturday, they'd all head home. And on the night of Saturday, February 9th, 1991, about 9 months after the first call from that fan, this was exactly what Diane and the kids were doing, returning from her mother's. That night, Diane left Detroit a little after 4 p.m. So by the time she was pulling on to Divison Drive around 6 p.m., the sun was just beginning to set. Diane turned on her headlights, and when the King's black mailbox came into view, Diane tightened her grip around the steering wheel. It had been more than 3 months since she received the letter, but just the sight of that mailbox still filled her with dread. Diane turned onto the gravel driveway leading to the house, and as she made her way up the long, narrow path, she spotted the signal light on inside the farmhouse up ahead, meaning Brad was home and everything was safe and she could get out of her car and just go inside. But, as Diane was about to find out, Brad was not inside the house, and it was definitely not safe for Diane to get out of the car. About 30 minutes after Diane pulled into the driveway and saw the signal light, a call came into the dispatch office at the local police department. It was Brad, and he was hysterical. He was so shaken up by what he had just seen that he could barely form a sentence. But he was able to eventually communicate with the dispatcher that he'd just found his wife lying in their driveway, not moving, and there was blood in her mouth. When the police arrived less than 10 minutes later, they found Brad sobbing and pacing around the driveway. Diane was just lying in the middle of the driveway next to her car, and their two kids, 2-year-old Marler and 3-month-old Kateri, were still sitting in the back seat of the car, crying uncontrollably. The reason Brad had left them in the car was because, as cruel as it seems, Brad knew from his work as a cop and as a criminal justice professor that even just opening the door to the car could potentially contaminate a crime scene. The responding officer walked right up to Diane and knelt down next to her. Even without much blood, it was obvious that Diane had suffered some sort of horrible injury and was definitely deceased. The officer spent a few minutes looking her over and eventually found the likely cause of death. There were 2 bullet holes in her body, one in her chest and the other near her waistline. An autopsy would later reveal that the shot to Diane's chest had been the fatal one. It had caused so much internal damage that she had died within 3 minutes of impact. Initially, though, the police had no idea how long ago those shots had been fired. But when the officer touched Diane's body, he found that it was still warm, which meant her killer might still be in the area. Instinctively, the officer grabbed his radio and called for backup. Over the next 2 hours, a small army of investigators would descend on Divison Drive. They would search the property for fingerprints and evidence, and they would interview neighbors and potential witnesses, and after a little while, they would bring one of the best trackers in the state onto the property, a German Shepherd named Travis. When Travis arrived on the scene, the dog quickly locked onto a scent trail. The dog took off running from the farmhouse straight back into the forest behind the home. The dog ran through muddy, brushy fields, then he crossed a creek, and then he sort of just stopped, turned around, and headed back to the farmhouse, where a crowd of investigators and neighbors were beginning to form outside. At the time, Travis's handler assumed that the dog had just kind of lost the scent at some point in the woods, and that was why he had stopped, turned around, and just gone back to the farmhouse. But many months after that night, once the police had figured out what happened to Diane, they would look back at Travis's initial movements that night and realize the dog had not simply given up and returned to the farmhouse. The dog had just continued to follow the scent trail, which happened to stop somewhere in the middle of the woods, turn around, and then come back to the farmhouse. In fact, that night that Diane was discovered, the killer was standing right outside of Diane and Brad's home among the police and onlookers. After being arrested, Diane's killer did not confess to the murder, and so we don't have every detail of what happened in the final moments of Diane's life. However, based on several key interviews and pieces of evidence, this is what investigators believe happened to Diane. About an hour before Diane returned home from Detroit on the night she was killed, Diane's killer entered her farmhouse and turned on a particular light inside. The killer knew about the light signal system that Brad and Diane had created to make Diane feel safe, and now the killer was going to use that system to lure Diane into a trap. After switching the signal light on, the killer walked back outside and headed for the old red and white Victorian barn, which was situated in front of Diane and Brad's property, just to the left of the gravel driveway. There was no light in the old barn, but it didn't matter. The killer had been on this property many times in the past and had even practiced this particular route in the darkness when no one else was home. Inside the barn, the killer walked past the family's tractor and the many tools they left lying on the ground. The killer walked past the family's protection dog, but the dog just kind of looked up and didn't even bark. And then the killer reached the back of the barn and climbed a narrow staircase which led to a large, dusty loft area. The killer paused briefly at the top of the stairs. The floor of the loft was covered in straw, and at the far end of the loft, away from the killer, was a sliding door that was open just wide enough for what the killer needed to do. The killer walked over to this slightly open door and peered outside. From there, they could see the front of the farmhouse and the driveway and the spot where Diane parked her car, which was about 70 feet away. The killer checked their watch. It was getting late, which meant Diane would be arriving soon. So the killer got into position. The killer lay belly down in the straw facing the gap in the door, and then they reached out their arm to the right and stuffed their hand into some nearby straw. A moment later, they pulled out a weapon that had been hidden inside the straw, a .22 caliber rifle. About 20 minutes later, the killer spotted a pair of headlights coming down Divison Drive. The killer raised their rifle and looked through the scope, and sure enough, Diane was sitting behind the wheel of this car. As she turned onto her long gravel driveway, the killer flicked the rifle off safe. The killer held Diane in their sights as she drove up the driveway to the house. And when she got close enough that the killer could hear the gravel under her tires, the killer slipped their finger over the trigger. Diane reached her normal parking spot located off to one side of the driveway close to the house, and then she turned the car off. As she gathered her things inside of the car, the killer pushed the rifle's barrel through the small opening in the sliding door and focused their sights on Diane's car door. A moment later, that door opened up and Diane stepped out onto the driveway. The killer paused for a second, taking in the sight of the woman they had terrorized for months and months, calling her over and over and over again at work, and then leaving her that threatening letter in her mailbox. Then, the obsessed fan / Diane's killer squeezed the trigger. The bullet hit Diane squarely in the chest, throwing her body backwards onto the ground and tearing through her insides. After watching her fall to the ground, the killer quickly got up and, with the rifle in his hand, hustled back to the stairs, climbed down to the first floor of the barn, and then marched outside over to Diane's body. Everything was going exactly to plan until the killer spotted something he did not expect to see. Diane's two kids, Marler and Kateri, were still sitting in the back seat of her car. The killer began to panic. Why were the kids here? The killer was certain Diane's plan had been to leave her kids in Detroit for the weekend with her grandmother. But, as the police would later discover, the arrangements for the kids were changed at the last minute because one of the kids had gotten sick while they were at Diane's mom's house, so Diane just brought the kids home with her. But for Diane's killer, the kids presented a huge problem, because after killing Diane, the killer had planned to drive away, get rid of the gun, and then try to establish some kind of alibi before Diane was discovered. But now there were these two kids in this car without heat in the middle of winter in freezing cold Michigan, and so if the killer left, the kids would freeze to death, and the killer was not trying to kill anyone except for Diane. So the killer changed plans. First, he turned away from the kids, crouched down, and then fired an additional shot into Diane's body to make sure she was dead. This was the shot that tore into her waistline. Then the killer turned and ran into the forest behind the farmhouse and charged through muddy, brushy fields across a creek to a spot where they were able to hide the rifle, and then the killer turned back around and ran back to the driveway of the King's house. When the killer got there, they ran up to the car window and looked inside and waved to the two kids and said, "Everything's gonna be fine, okay? Daddy's here. I'm gonna make a phone call and then I'll be right back." Then, Brad King, aka Diane's obsessed fan, aka Diane's killer, ran inside of his house that he shared with Diane and called the police. When they answered, Brad hysterically told him that he had just been out for a walk in the woods, and when he came back, he had found his poor wife lying in the driveway, not moving. It would turn out Brad King had been obsessed with Diane ever since the first day he met her. She was beautiful and funny and more ambitious than anyone Brad had ever met. Diane dreamed of becoming a news anchor, and Brad wanted to help make Diane's dreams come true. So, while Diane was off working her way up to the news desk, Brad spent most of his time working to make sure she had everything she needed to be successful. He cooked Diane's meals and ironed her clothes, he handled the shopping, and when the kids came along, Brad took care of them too. And as far as Brad was concerned, everything was working out great. Until one day, when Diane came to him and told him that she wanted to quit her job at the TV station so that she could stay home and raise the kids. In fact, she told him she was planning to leave the station the summer after Kateri was born. Diane hadn't formalized this announcement yet, but pretty much everyone in Diane's inner circle knew about her plans. But the problem was, if Diane was going to stay home, then Brad would have to be the family's primary breadwinner. And being a part-time professor just wasn't going to cut it. He would have to go out and find a full-time job, which was something Brad simply didn't want to do. He had grown to love not working very much, and he was not prepared to change that. However, when Brad voiced his concern to Diane about not wanting to work full-time, she was empathetic, but said it was really important for her and the kids that she be home with them, so he would just have to kind of accept it and get a full-time job. However, Brad did not accept this. Instead, he decided he would just kill Diane. And because of his background as a police officer and as a criminal justice professor, he was confident he could get away with it. Brad knew that whenever a woman got murdered, the male partner is almost always identified as a primary suspect. So Brad knew he would need to create another suspect to divert attention away from himself. This is when Brad came up with this obsessed fan concept. About 10 months before Diane's murder, Brad began calling Diane's TV station, pretending to be this obsessed fan. He would intentionally slur words and slow down his speech to make sure Diane could not recognize him. Then, about 5 months after that first call, when by this point everybody in town knew about Diane's stalker, Brad decided to up the ante. On the night before Halloween, Brad left that threatening letter in the mailbox. He used cutout letters so Diane could not identify his handwriting, and he did it because he knew that type of letter would be more intimidating because of its use in scary movies. And the letter worked. It terrified Diane, and most importantly, it brought more attention to this fake fan, to the point where the police were actively searching for this person. This obsessed fan had become so real that by the time Brad was ready to kill his wife, he felt certain that nobody would even look twice at him. But thanks to his kids still being in the car after he killed Diane, Brad had not been able to flee the scene like he had hoped, and so he had to come up with a story about how he had been walking in the woods that night and had returned home and came upon his wife in the driveway, and that's when he called police. But this story didn't make sense. Police discovered that Brad would have known exactly what time Diane was coming home that night because Diane's mom had called Brad and told him when Diane had left her house. And based on the system that he and Diane had, Brad would have known that Diane would have expected him to be at their house waiting for her when she arrived. So why would Brad choose to be out on a walk in the woods at the exact moment Diane was arriving home? Also, neighbors had just seen Brad carrying the .22 caliber rifle that was used to kill Diane. The gun was located in the creek behind their house, roughly where Travis the tracking dog had gone on the first night of the investigation. And in the barn, police also found a single shell casing from the shot that killed Diane. On December 13th, 1992, Brad was convicted of murdering his wife, Diane. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He never showed any remorse for her murder. Diane was buried in Detroit, near where her family lived. On her headstone, it says, "Beloved daughter, sister, mother." Diane was also, of course, a wife, but her family decided not to include that word. Located in the far northwestern section of Canada is the aptly named Northwest Territories. It is a massive swath of land that virtually nobody lives inside of. To make that point crystal clear, consider the following. The country of Germany has a population of 83 million people, give or take. The Northwest Territories is 4 times as large as Germany, but only has a population of about 50,000 people. In addition to being this huge and mostly unoccupied space, the Northwest Territories are almost completely wild. Think dense forests, huge mountains, massive rivers and lakes, and lots of really big animals. Even for highly experienced outdoors men and women, the Northwest Territories can be a truly hazardous place. And within this truly hazardous place, there is one part that is the most hazardous, and it's right in the middle of the Northwest Territories. And it's this 11,000 square mile stretch of just pure wilderness that's called the Nahanni Valley. In 1976, the Nahanni Valley was made into a national park. But don't let that fool you. This is not some family park that anybody can go to. There are no tourist accommodations, so there's no hotels, there's really nothing inside of it, and there are no roads that lead into this park. The only way you can get inside this valley is by plane or by boat or by very stressful and difficult overland hike. But for those who are able and willing to make the effort to get inside of this valley, you have the opportunity to explore one of the most beautiful places on the planet, because this section of the world is almost completely untouched by man. It is really nature at its purest form. However, there's a catch. This valley is said to be haunted. Over the last 10,000 years, the handful of native tribes that have attempted to settle inside of the Nahanni Valley have all either suddenly disappeared without a trace, like the Naha tribe that literally overnight just was gone, leaving behind their shelters, their food, their supplies, just gone. No one knows what happened to them. Or the tribes have abruptly fled, claiming they were being terrorized or stalked by creatures lurking in the forest, like these white demons and these large wolves they called wahilas. Now, of course, this just sounds like folklore, and it might very well be that that's all it is, folklore. But starting in the early 1900s, some very strange things started happening in the Nahanni Valley that were not folklore. These things happened, and they were horrifying. These were horrifying, real events. And they might, depending on your viewpoint, give credit to some of the theories that the native tribespeople have about this valley, which is there's something evil lurking out in this forest, but we just don't know what it is. In 1904, three brothers, Willie, Frank, and Charlie McLeod, who all lived in the Northwest Territories, decided they wanted to go looking for gold in the Nahanni Valley. They figured because so few people had ever been inside of this valley that if there was gold to be found, then certainly it had not been found yet. And so after a very long and arduous journey using sled dogs and trains and homemade boats, they finally slipped into the valley and found themselves on what's called the Flat River, which runs right through the center of the Nahanni Valley. Now, the Flat River is kind of ironically named because it's anything but flat. It's actually more like a rapid at certain points. But either way, the three brothers, they're on their boat, they're making their way up the Flat River, and at some point they pull off onto the riverbank and they set up camp. And then once their camp is set up, they go down to the river and they put their gold sluices in the water. A gold sluice is this long, skinny box that's usually made of wood, and it has a strainer on one side. And gold miners will put it in the water submerged, and they will kind of shovel the sediment on the bottom of the water into this little funnel, and the big stuff will get stopped by the strainer, and the dirt and the water will just kind of flow out the side. And so the idea is you can trap gold nuggets inside of this sluice. And so the three brothers, they get their sluices up and they start looking for gold, and right away they hit pay dirt. There is tons of gold in this river. And so all day, all night, they get all this gold. The next morning they do the same thing. And by the time all their containers are literally filled to the brim with gold, they decide, hey, let's go back and turn this in, get some money for it, and then come back out here. And so they pack up their tent, they pack up all their supplies, and they put everything back in their boat. They get out onto Flat River, and at some point, very early on in their journey back, the boat capsizes, and the boat actually breaks apart from the strength of the rapids of Flat River. And so the boat actually just sinks, and much of their supplies sink, including all of their gold. But the three brothers are able to grab some of their supplies, like their rifle and some lumber, and some of their mining supplies, and they swim it all to shore. So they catch their breath, they're totally devastated at the loss of the gold, but they're alive, they have enough supplies to survive, and so they figure all they can do is maybe try to go back to their original site, try to get some more gold because they did still have a sluice, and then try to get out of there and then, regroup and come back another time. And so using some of the lumber they recovered from their broken boat, and then also by cutting down some trees, they literally fashioned another boat and then hopped back on the Flat River, and they went back up to that site where they had found gold earlier. They set up their sluice, they set up their camp again, and this time they didn't find any gold. So all day, this very disappointing day that they've already lost all their gold, now they're not finding any more gold. And so that night when they went to bed, they decided that the next day they were just going to leave. And so the next day they get up, they pack up, they hop back on the Flat River on this new boat they built, and they're able to make their way out of the valley and get back to their homes. As soon as they get back home, the two younger brothers, Willie and Frank, start talking about how they want to go back into Nahanni Valley and go get more gold, because now they know there's gold out there. It's not a question, yeah, we didn't find it that second time, but we know it's out there. Charlie, the older brother, he wanted to get the gold, but he felt like, hey, that was a close call with the boat flipping over. I don't know if it's a good idea, so I'm actually not going to go. You guys can go. I'm going to stay. And so several months goes by, and Frank and Willie have been doing all this preparation for this additional trip into the valley. And finally, in 1905, they're ready. And so Willie, Frank, and a third man called Robert Weir, who was a friend of theirs, he was going to replace Charlie. The three of them, they make their way up into the valley. Now, they didn't tell anyone how long they were going to be gone for, and so when they didn't send any word and no one had heard from them in weeks, Charlie was actually not that concerned because he knew there was lots of gold to be had out in the Nahanni Valley, and so he figured they must have struck it rich, and now they've decided to live out there long term, or at least maybe through the summer, or maybe the next year. And so he wasn't concerned, and because he wasn't concerned, nobody else was concerned about these three men. And so weeks turned into months, turned into a year, and still no one's heard from these three men. No one's heard from Willie, Frank, or from Robert, but still Charlie maintains that nothing can be wrong because there's three of them out there. They're incredibly experienced. There is a ton of gold out there. I'm sure they're just killing it and they're just acquiring all this gold, and we're going to see them in the next couple of months maybe, and everything's going to be just fine. But a whole other year would go by, so they've been out there for 2 years and no one has heard from them. And at this point, Charlie thinks to himself, okay, I have to go out and see if they're okay. And so he rounds up 4 other people from his town and he mounts an expedition to head back into the Nahanni Valley to go find his 2 brothers and find Robert Weir. Charlie and his search party eventually, after yet another long and arduous journey, they get into Nahanni Valley and they get onto the Flat River. And so they start making their way upstream along Flat River. So it must have been a very treacherous journey getting through the rapids of this river. And the whole time they're scanning the left and the right side, hoping to see some sign of life. They're looking for any indication that these 3 men are out here and just fine, but they didn't see any sign of them. And so they finally made their way all the way up to the very end of Flat River, or I should say the very beginning of Flat River, where it breaks off from a much larger river called the South Nahanni River. And once they turned onto the South Nahanni River, they began going downstream. And again, they're looking on either side for any sign of these 3 men. There's no sign of them. And then the river they're on takes a very sharp turn. It's actually called the Big Bend, and it's about a 45-degree turn. And as soon as you make that turn, it dumps you into this 10-mile stretch of river called Second Canyon. Now, along South Nahanni River, which is about 350 miles long, there are these 4 canyons that the water passes through. And they're labeled 4th Canyon, 3rd Canyon, 2nd Canyon, and 1st Canyon. And these canyons are massive. These sheer cliffs on either side of the river shoot up to 3,000 feet above the water. And in some parts, the water is actually just as deep, thousands of feet deep. And Second Canyon is unique because the cliff faces are as sheer as you're going to get. And the cliff faces almost butt up exactly up against the water. So there's really very little shoreline on either side. So once you're in this 10-mile stretch, you're basically boxed in. You have thousands of feet of water below you. You have these massive cliffs on either side, and there's really nowhere to go. You need to get through this section of the river before you can effectively get onto the shoreline and take a break from being in your boat. And along these cliffs are these openings you see high up all over the cliffs on both sides that are openings to these massive cave systems inside of these thousands of feet tall cliffs. And because of how difficult it is to not only get to Nahanni Valley, but also to get up to these different cave openings, nobody's gone inside of them. We don't know what's inside of these caves, save for the few that are down low enough that people can explore. So as you're passing through Second Canyon, it's almost like you're being watched because there's all of these openings, but you can't see into them, and you're just forced to go down this 10-mile stretch, and you can't really go anywhere, and whatever's watching you, it's watching you. As soon as Charlie and his search party entered into Second Canyon, it would have immediately gotten darker because that's another part of being in Second Canyon. These huge cliff walls of this canyon obscure the sunlight. And so they would have entered into this canyon, it would have gotten darker, and it's very windy inside of Second Canyon. So the winds would have picked up, so it's dark, very strange setting for them to be in, and they would have been looking on either side at these little strips of shoreline on either side, barely big enough for a boat to be. They would have been looking for any sign of life, but they didn't see anything. As they're making their way down this 10-mile stretch, as they're getting closer and closer to actually entering into First Canyon, which is the next canyon you would enter into, the sides of the river start to get slightly larger where you could actually beach a boat. There's some trees. And on the left-hand side, right before exiting Second Canyon, they notice there is actually a tent perched within some trees. And so the search party naturally goes right over to the shoreline. They hop out, but as soon as they step foot on land and they have a clearer view of this tent and what's outside of it, they notice there is a body clearly lying on the ground outside of the tent. And so Charlie and the search party, they run over, and as soon as they're up close, they can tell this body is missing its head. And they see the clothes on this body are totally charred and burned, and whoever this was, they were reaching with their right arm when they died. And right outside of the reach of their right arm was a rifle that was propped up against a tree. And so they walk around this one body and they go around towards the backside of the tent where the opening to this tent is, and they find another body, another very badly decomposed body, and it's positioned kind of halfway in the tent and halfway out of the tent. And there's a blanket kind of partially obscuring this person's body, and when they move the blanket, they see this body too is missing its head. So Charlie and the search party, they continue to search around the camp in hopes of finding the heads of these two people to try to figure out who they are, but they never find the heads. However, they do find some personal effects both in the pockets of these two bodies and then also inside the tent that would confirm these are Charlie's brothers. As for the third man that had been with them, Robert Weir, he was not at the campsite, and in fact, he would never actually be found officially. However, a little ways down the river, another partial skeleton would be found several months later that was attributed to Robert. However, that was not 100% confirmed to be Robert. The only other interesting thing that was found at this campsite was a carving in a nearby tree, and it just said, "We have found a fine prospect," indicating that Charlie's brothers had found gold. But there was no gold either on them or in their camp or in the river nearby. Nothing. There was no gold. Charlie and his search party would leave the valley and get in touch with the mounted police, who would come out to the site where the brothers had been found. They would launch an investigation, and ultimately they would come to the conclusion that all three of these men, the two brothers and Robert, had starved to death, and then after they had perished, animals had taken them off, which is why Robert was found so far away and why the skulls were missing from the two brothers. Now, Charlie did not believe that. He believed they had been attacked by native tribes in the area, but the police were not buying that. They said this was a natural thing, this was an accident, and so that's that. When the story of these two decapitated men made the news, people went crazy about this. People were very divided about what they thought really happened. There was a percentage of people that believed that partial skeleton that was found, that was not Robert Weir. He had not died. He had murdered the two brothers, decapitated them, and then made off with their gold. The other percentage of people believed that all three men, the two brothers and Robert, had been attacked by a person, a group of people, an animal, a creature, something. There was some sort of attack. And that's why the two brothers were in those positions that indicated they had encountered something horrifying, with one brother reaching for the gun and the other appearing to have leapt from his bed before he ultimately died. But regardless of which side you fell on, pretty much everybody at the time who heard about the story became terrified of the Nahanni Valley. Specifically, they became terrified of that stretch in Second Canyon where the two brothers had been found. And so actually that stretch got renamed the Headless Valley, and from that point forward, that's all it was known as. And so even though there were obvious gold prospects in the Headless Valley and all along the South Nahanni River and the Flat River, people after this story broke were just not prepared to risk going in there and potentially becoming another victim. And so people kind of stayed away from Nahanni Valley. 8 years later, though, in 1913, a gold prospector named Martin Jorgensen decided, you know what? I'm not going to let some scary stories about some headless men and, ghosts and killers on the loose. I'm not going to let any of that get in the way of me taking gold out of Nahanni Valley. So all on his own, Martin makes the arduous trek inside of Nahanni Valley. He makes his way up Flat River, and he finally finds a spot about 70 miles upstream of where Headless Valley was. And he actually built a one-room cabin, because he was going to stay there through the winter, and then the plan was he would meet up with his partners the following summer. And so right after he got there, he set up his sluices and he started mining for gold, and apparently he found a lot of it, because he sent word back to his partners outside of the valley that he had made it rich. And so his partners were really excited to meet up with him the following summer and see how much he got, because they planned on going back into the valley with him that summer. So that summer rolls around, his partners go to the meeting spot right outside the valley, but Martin doesn't show up. And so his partners, they stay outside at this meeting space for several days until finally, when he doesn't show up, they decide, we have to go in there and see if he is okay, because at this point he should have been here. There's no excuse. And so they end up going into the Nahanni Valley. They make their way up Flat River and they go roughly to the area where they knew he was staying based on the message he had sent earlier. He had described where he was staying, and they actually found his cabin, or I should say they found what was left of his cabin. His cabin had been completely torched, burned to the ground, and laying on the ground next to the burned out cabin was the burned out remains of another headless corpse. And this corpse belonged to Martin Jorgensen. The police did a thorough investigation, but they were never able to determine what actually killed him. The police did not connect Martin's death with the two McLeod brothers' deaths, even though they were all decapitated. They were in roughly the same area, and it happened within a few years of each other, and they looked very, very similar. Even though that all was true, the police said, nope, these are totally separate. Martin died for some reason, and then animals took parts of him away, and that's why his skull is missing. Martin's skull was never located, and the gold that Martin claimed to have struck it rich with was also not at the cabin, not on him. There was no gold anywhere in the vicinity. When Martin's death made the news, people went crazy, and despite the police assuring everyone that his death was not connected to the McLeod brothers' deaths, even though the police were saying that, the public didn't see it that way. It was just too easy to connect one decapitation with two other decapitations that have happened close together in a relatively short time frame, and so a lot of people assumed there must be a killer on the loose somewhere in Nahanni Valley. 7 years later, in 1921, the rumors of a killer on the loose were still alive and well when gold prospector John O'Brien and his partner decided, you know what? Despite the rumors of this so-called killer or whatever's going on in the Nahanni Valley, let's go into the Nahanni Valley and try our hand. Let's try to get some gold. And so the two of them made their way into the valley and they set up camp in Headless Valley, not far from where the McLeod brothers had been found decapitated. So they set up their camp and they're there for a couple of days. They're doing well. They're finding gold. And then at some point, John tells his partner that he's going to go out and check all of their traps along the river. And he'll be back in about 8 or 9 days. And so his partner waits 8 or 9 days and John doesn't come back. And a couple of days after that goes by and now John's past due. And so the partner decides he has to go out looking for him. And so there was another gold prospector in the area. And so this partner contacted him and the two of them went to the river and began walking upstream until they found John. And he had frozen to death, but it was very interesting the way he was positioned. He was sitting in front of this obviously previously lit campfire. He wasn't hunched over, but he didn't look like he was in pain. He looked like he was just enjoying the fire. There was nothing on his face that indicated discomfort or pain or fear. He was even holding the matchbook in his hand. It was like he was just sitting there enjoying the fire when something caused him to suddenly freeze. In fact, witnesses would say John looked like he had been flash frozen, as if it had happened in a matter of seconds, because it didn't look like he had reacted properly to freezing to death. And the police, when they came out, they would say, this is odd. This is odd the way he's positioned, but ultimately he died because he froze to death, and so there's no foul play here, and so no further investigation is needed. 5 years later, in 1926, a hunting party that included a young woman named Annie Lafferty was camping out along the Flat River inside of Headless Valley. And so that night, they're all kind of joking around the fire, and then at some point they decide to all go to sleep. And then the next day, when everybody gets up, Annie is no longer in camp. And there's no sign of where she went. And so they begin by yelling out and walking around the immediate vicinity to see maybe if she stepped away for a minute, but Annie's just gone and no one knows where she went. And so the hunting party spends the rest of the day looking for Annie, but there's no sign of her. They ultimately leave the valley. They tell police come out. There's this huge search, but Annie's never found. Several months later, a man named Charlie, who happened to have been out near Flat River, near this hunting party when they were out there, but Charlie himself was not in the hunting party. He didn't know Annie. He was just in the vicinity. He overheard someone talking about a member of that hunting party, specifically a woman, going missing. And when he heard that, he knew he had to tell police what he had seen that night out near Flat River. So he goes to police and he explains that that night when he knew there was this hunting party over there, he could hear them, he knew they were over there. He said at some point he went to bed and then he woke up when he heard the sound of rocks falling into the river in front of him. He was sleeping along the river's edge. So he sits up and he looks out across the river. It's totally dark, but there's some moonlight and he's kind of looking around wondering what's causing the sound, but he can't see it. And then he hears it again and he can tell it's off to his left. And these are not huge rocks. These are like medium to small size rocks, like rocks you could just pick up and throw. And so he's looking and all of a sudden he sees maybe a couple hundred yards away through some sparse trees, he sees a naked woman, a white naked woman running on all fours up this mountainside. And as she's running up the mountainside, her feet and her hands are knocking little rocks into the river down below. She's right on the edge of this cliff. And as she's running up this hill, she stops and she turns and he gets a good look at her face. And Charlie would say he was so taken aback by her face. It looked like she was possessed. There was something wrong with her face. And so Charlie instinctively ducked down and chose not to follow her, even though he knew anybody running naked anywhere in the wilds is doomed. But he felt like he could not go near this woman. There was something wrong with this woman. And so the police, they take this story down and they say, hey, this is what Annie looked like. And Charlie would say, I think that's her. I think that matches her description. And so universally, it's believed this woman galloping up this hillside in the middle of the night naked was Annie. Police ultimately would not investigate Annie's disappearance any further because at the time Charlie was telling them this piece of information, she'd already been gone for months and the assumption was she was dead. 4 years later, in 1931, another gold prospector decides to try their luck in Headless Valley. A man named Phil Powers. He makes his way into the valley. He finds a spot off of Flat River. He builds a cabin. And then shortly thereafter, his cabin burns to the ground with him inside of it. Now, his skeleton was intact, but the strange thing about his death is based on the origin of the fire, which would have been on the roof. He should have had an opportunity to climb out of the cabin before it burned down, giving rise to the theory that he was actually dead before the fire started. However, the police said this was an accident caused by Phil doing something with the stovepipe that led to it catching on fire, and this was just all one big accident. But the vast majority of people that have followed along to this point with all of these strange deaths, they were just not buying it. 5 years later, in 1936, two more gold prospectors, William Epler and Joseph Mulholland, they entered the Headless Valley to try their luck, and shortly after arriving and getting set up, they went missing. A search party came out to look for them, and they found their cabin, and just like Phil Powers, it had burned to the ground, but William and Joseph were not in the ashes. They were not anywhere nearby. In fact, they were never found. No one has any idea what happened to them, and no one knows what caused the fire. 9 years later, in 1945, yet another gold prospector named Ernest Savard entered the Headless Valley to go looking for gold, and then when he did not leave the valley for an intended rendezvous with some of his partners went looking for him, and they would find him inside of his sleeping bag laying down, decapitated right along the Flat River inside of the Headless Valley. And so the police would come out, they would do an investigation, and they would call this an accident where, he starved to death or he died of hypothermia. And then after he was dead, animals must have come in and removed his skull, and that's why we can't find it. And so the police did not, at least not publicly, connect his death to all of the other decapitations in that small area. 1 year later, in 1946, another gold miner named John Patterson went into Headless Valley and he went missing. And so a search party went in looking for him, and John would never be found. But on one of the last nights that the search party was in the Headless Valley, they were camping out near Flat River, some native tribespeople came into their camp and they warned them about some white figures that were walking around the valley that night. They're down near the river, they're out in the forest, they're kind of all around here. And so you really need to be careful. You don't want them to see you. And then these tribespeople just left. And so the search party is absolutely horrified. They know about the rumors of this place. They're out here looking for someone that's gone missing in this place. And all night, all they hear are distant howls and screams that they hadn't heard in the previous nights. They're hearing these wailing sounds coming from all around them, like these things that are out there were intentionally trying to scare them to get them to leave. It felt like they were not supposed to be there. The next day, first thing when they got up and they left, the leader of that search party would say he just felt like the whole valley was totally sinister, and that constant wailing they heard the night before, he said he will never forget. From the mid-1940s onward, there have been far less strange incidents reported inside of Nahanni Valley, but one could attribute that to the fact that far less people have been going into Nahanni Valley ever since the 1940s. And in recent times, huge segments of the park have been permanently closed. The park has said the reason they're doing that is to protect that segment of the park. But other people have speculated that at least part of the reason why they're closing these segments, many of which are right near the Headless Valley, is because they're trying to protect people from getting anywhere near whatever it is that's lurking inside of that park. But regardless, it is still a fact that over the last century, there have been dozens and dozens and dozens of people that have either gone missing or who have died under very mysterious circumstances inside of this valley. And the truth is, nobody knows why. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please invite the 5-star review button over to your kid's birthday party and then ask them if they want to hit the piñata. When they say yes, put their blindfold on and then replace the piñata with a beehive. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen Podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username on every platform is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.